This is the last of the panels for the CyCon. So this is the end. Yeah, I am all that stands between you and Dmitry Alperovich, who will, I'm sure, have a very interesting talk. I get to be the moderator for a discussion on internet governance with our three guests, Laura DeNardis, Robert Kahn, Milton Mueller. Their full biographies are in the conference program online. Let me just start. Professor DeNardis is both an engineer and a policy expert. We'll talk a little bit about some of the things she's working on now. She's been at the State Department where I worked for a number of years. She's worked with the CG folks up in Canada. She's an expert on internet governance. And was previously at the Yale Law School for their Information Society project. Robert Kahn, we probably have all heard of. He's the CEO and president of the Corporation for National Research Initiatives, which he founded in 1986. After his term at DARPA, he was on the staff at Bell Labs, assistant professor of electrical engineering at MIT, and then joined Bolt, Beranek, and Newman, which had been in the news of late. He moved from DARPA to the Information Processing Techniques Office and initiated the $1 billion Strategic Computer Program, and has done thing after thing, and is a Turing Award winner and has Presidential Medal and. And then Milton Mueller was my professor in grad school, so that's all you really need to know about him. He recently migrated from Syracuse to Georgia Tech, something I understand, having gone to Syracuse and then migrated to the University of Houston. Cold weather, be darned. He's written a number of influential books. I think I just had students go back through Ruling the Root and find what was pertinent in it, and it still remains interesting and relevant. He has been on the ARIN, the advisory committee for Registry of Internet Numbers, and has had a number of sponsored research initiatives on internet governance. So I'm going to ask each speaker to make a short presentation today, and then we're going to do some Q&A among the panel, and then we'll open it up for audience Q&A and before moving on to our final talk. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chris, and good morning, everyone. I'm delighted to make some opening framing remarks about internet governance this morning. I wrote a book called The Global War for Internet Governance, and I picked a provocative title because of how internet governance conflicts are increasingly becoming a contested space where economic and political power is unfolding. They're obviously entangled with civil liberties like freedom of expression and privacy. They're entangled with national security, with global innovation policy. But the distributed nature of the technologies underlying systems of internet governance are shifting power in some ways from traditional bordered nation states to the private sector and to new kinds of global institutions. And this area has traditionally been technically very esoteric to many and complicated. So to a certain extent, it has been outside of public view. Not intentionally out of public view, but concealed nevertheless. But I've been fascinated to watch over the last certainly decade and more than decade how concerns about internet governance have transformed from being of concern to, for example, those of us in this room and those of us on this panel and a subset of academics in the technical community and a handful of policymakers to being a national policy priority for leaders around the world, from Russia to Brazil to China to the United States. So questions about the control and security of the internet obviously rank high in importance with other kinds of global collective action problems like human rights, climate change, environmental protection, and countering terrorism. Now, there are obvious reasons for this. The internet adds trillions of dollars to the global economy. It is, every sector of the economy, it depends upon the internet to function. It may even be more important for political and social processes. So an outage in cyberspace now results in an outage in society and politics and the economy. So the stakes are incredibly high. Now, one point I would like to make, even though I often call internet governance an oxymoron, is that the internet is, of course, already governed. But it's not one system. It's not governed by any single set of actors. It involves a variety of different kinds of functions, some including control of names and numbers, some involving interconnection coordination, the development of technical standard setting, of course, cybersecurity governance. So there are all kinds of areas of tasks of internet governance, rather, and the way I usually define the topic of internet governance is that it involves the administration and the coordination of the technologies that are necessary to keep the internet operational, and then the enactment of substantive policy around this. But there are many actors involved, many tasks, so when we get a question like who should control the internet, Google or the US government, or ICANN or something else, the question makes absolutely no sense whatsoever. It's multi-layered and involves a variety of actors, which is why the term multi-stakeholder governance is usually used. Now, these are very technical functions. As mentioned, I have an engineering background as well as a policy background, but nevertheless, these kinds of technical functions have very significant policy implications. Obviously, outages due to attacks on the DNS or routing systems can have very significant implications. How standards are developed, such as with the World Wide Web, affects how disabled people can access the internet, for example. It doesn't just happen, it has to be engineered into the system. Private companies, like information intermediaries, the Facebooks and the Googles and the Twitters and other kinds of content intermediaries, establish public policy through their privacy terms of service, through how they handle cyberbullying and the extent of security that they provide. So these are very, very real public policy issues. Another point I would like to suggest as part of the framing for this panel is that there's a turn to infrastructure in internet governance to achieve political and economic policies. So I recently had a book come out called The Turn to Infrastructure in Internet Governance. And it's about how governments and other kinds of forces are co-opting infrastructure for political purposes that have nothing to do with keeping the internet operational. Of course, there's a very long history of this. But what I'm suggesting is that we need to extend the concept of governance by internet infrastructure to the phenomenon of governance by tampering with infrastructure. In other words, imposing technical or statutory or other kinds of requirements to modify the design of the internet to achieve certain kinds of objectives. And we certainly could talk all day about that, but a few examples would be the laws and policies involved in data localization, trying to impose requirements about where companies can store data, for example. Interest in building encryption backdoors is another example, and then tampering with the DNS through local redirection. And I'll make one more framing comment and then turn it over to my colleagues. Finally, another phenomenon is that in internet governance discussions, we have to think about the internet no longer as a communication system, but as a control system. So obviously it is still a communication system, but it's also a control system in which more objects than people are connected to the network. So society is moving clearly from a world in which content is digitally mediated to one in which all of life's objects are digitally mediated, whether wireless heart monitors, home alarm systems, weather sensors, surveillance, monitors, cars, energy systems, and of course industrial control systems. So this means that democratic freedoms around the internet are no longer merely about content. Fundamental human rights and the protection of human security depend upon an underlying system of technological infrastructure that creates certain conditions for innovation and civil liberties online. So again, these are not conditions that are preordained in any way. In the same way that the internet continually changes, the governance systems around the internet continually evolve and have to be deliberately designed according to certain values. So with that, I'll just leave the final statement that democracy now is contingent upon cybersecurity. And human rights are now contingent upon cybersecurity within the internet governance realm. And I very much look forward to what my colleagues have to say and to our discussion that ensues afterwards. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Laura, for those remarks. It's an honor to introduce Robert Kahn to come speak. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all for getting up so early this morning. Happy to be here. I've been involved in most of the evolution of the internet from its earliest days, and so I've seen it go through many different variants. Words are important, and we tend to bandy around a lot of words without necessarily being on the same page as to what they mean. Laura made some very cogent remarks about internet governance, what it is and what it isn't. But I would start with the notion of what the internet is itself, because when I talk to people about it, I have the feeling that people have a general idea about it is that's very different than what I mean when I talk about the internet. So for me, the internet is not about the networks, it's not about the computers, it's not about the applications and any of that stuff, because when we started the internet project in the first place, we had all of those things around. What we didn't have was a way of making them all work together. And to me, the internet is about the protocols and the procedures that allow these things to work together. So it's about the information flows and making sure the information goes to the right place. The internet's also about logical extensions and follow-ons. It's grown by leaps and bounds in some dimensions, and in other ones, not at all. Architecturally, it's pretty much the same as we decided it should be 40 years ago when we were doing experimentation. Who knew what it would lead to, because we were just a bunch of scientists and researchers trying to demonstrate how to make that all happen. But today we have, the term internet governance, which Laura accurately portrayed as not really being governance in the traditional sense of the term. In fact, I think the only reason that this term is out there, just like cyber, is a way of talking about an area and giving a label to it, but the label doesn't mean anything more than it's an area of discussion. So if we were to, a whole series of internet governance forums that have been held around the world, in fact, I just flew back from one in Africa, the Africa IGF. If you think about, what this term actually means, well, it really doesn't mean anything at all. But if they were to call those meetings meeting on international coordination of public policy related matters, nobody would show up. The reason they call it internet governance, I think, is because people are worried that there might actually be a governance decision made of some sort, or something, portrayed that was really relevant to what they were talking about. So there really is no such thing as internet governance, because no one body governs the internet. It just isn't like that. So people will often ask, what's the world economy like? When I had a number of meetings back in the 80s with folks in the telecommunications industry, they were very interested in killing the internet, because infrastructure is always challenging to the status quo. It changes things. Changes the baseline, because it lowers barriers in certain dimensions. And when the telecommunications industry saw this happening, well, originally it was AT&T. AT&T, they didn't particularly think that this would make any difference, because they were a monopoly carrier at the time in the US. And they knew that at the right time they could jump in. But there was the dissolution of the Bell system a number of years later, and then when you had all the telcos in the US, and Sprint and MCI and all the RBOCs, when they first saw what was happening, their concern was, how do we kill this thing? I remember being called to meetings where they would, the ATM, which was their choice of network technology versus the internet, had big X for internet, and the question was, how do we kill the internet? And I said, you're asking the wrong question. The internet was never about competing with another technology. It was about making them work together. So even if the world adopted ATM, and I don't have a position on that, I'm relatively agnostic, how are you going to get the computer companies to agree? And what if you have another generation to ATM, even if everybody agrees? Do you always want it to be backwards compatible? You're going to need something like the internet around no matter what. Well, after a while, they just reluctantly accepted that was the case. About a year later, there was another meeting called, and they invited me to come back. This time they wanted to buy the internet. So the question was, what company should we buy? I said, suppose you wanted to own the world economy, what would you do? Would you buy every company in the world? I mean, the world economy is about the protocols and procedures for doing business. It's sort of the measure of all those transactions that take place, and that's really, in some sense, what the internet is all about in any event. Subsequently, I think they all decided it was their marketplace, and therefore they better go out and compete. And today, for the most part, the telecommunications industry, however you choose to define that, is pretty much running the underlying pieces of the internet. But the internet is not one thing. I mean, today, if you think about typical person, how they think about it, most people don't often distinguish between the internet and the web. They think the web and the internet are the same thing. They're absolutely not. The web is an application that was built on top of it some 20 years later. DNS was a choice. We funded some folks to actually come up with ideas. I was the one that actually selected the DNS for inclusion in the net. We made the transition in 1983. This is not an intrinsic part of the internet. It runs on IP addresses. That's how all the routing is done. But people weren't going to remember IP addresses, so this was an easy way to map from names into IP addresses. Well, today we have a similar situation, and we're finding that for the first time there are initiatives that are being taken around the world that I think are moving beyond where we are in this country, simply because we are so wedded to the past, and there's nothing to really challenge us in this country except possibly ideas. So that's very different from the situation as it was in the past. So what is the future likely to look like? Well, to me, if somebody said to you, I have a 1 billion volt wire and I'd like to install it in your house, would you like one? Your response probably should be, sounds dangerous, and what would I do with it anyway? And the answer is, it's infrastructure. Well, what do you do with infrastructure but build on it? An individual isn't going to build on a 1 billion volt wire, but a whole industry might. Maybe it'll be sufficient to build bigger plants that do more electrical things than we now do. Maybe it'll make some of the electric cars of the future charge in a few microseconds or minutes rather than hours or whatever they now take. But people get on the internet today for the purpose of accessing information, providing information, managing it. It may be information between different computers. It may be information that's shared between simulations that are running. There are all kinds of reasons why information is important, but nothing that we did in the early days was about managing the information itself. The model was, you move the bits around, and then with fingers on keyboards and eyes on screens, you simply navigate what you want and make it happen. A colleague of mine, in fact, worked with me for many years, is Philip Surf, and he and I did the original design of the TCP/IP protocols, and we were both at DARPA for a while. But in the process of doing that, we later got together in the 80s and came up with the notion of mobile programs. And the idea was to sort of free the user from having to be at a keyboard and a screen, instruct these avatars, if you will, to go around the internet, do your bidding, and then you could interact with them from time to time. And you spend your time with people rather than, on your smartphones, or we didn't have them back then, obviously, but you get the idea. At the time we introduced those ideas, viruses were first being generated in the internet environment, and many people objected to the idea of a mobile program that somebody else wrote showing up in their machine to execute. And there was a whole security apparatus that went with it, but that was almost beside the point because it was the way people felt about the technology that mattered, and they were scared about it. It's like, the invisible things you don't see are sometimes the scariest because you can't really put them into a tangible perspective. So what we did back then was to say, what we really need actually is a way of managing information, rather than assuming that people will know what to do with fingers on keyboards. And that's what we came up with. This was done with DARPA funding in the early 90s. And the framework is really very simple. It amounts to just a few primitives. In the world of communications, early on, we were dealing with packets. IP addresses were simply how do you route things to unique locations. In this new world of information, the lingua franca is digital objects. Well, a digital object is nothing more than a string of bits, a sequence of bits, or maybe it's a set of sequences. You might have a digital object that's, movie, it's got an audio part, a video part, or it might be, a book that's composed of chapters, or maybe there's music with the book in the future. These data structures will obviously evolve. Today, I think of a book as not just a literary work, but a package as well. It puts things together in a way that lets you deal with them. Today, it's a fairly simple structure, but in the future, it might be very complicated. The telecommunications industry has historically, moved bits through their networks based on knowing what they were ahead of time, and so they know how to process, streaming video or whatever it is that they're trying to put out. But suppose a data structure shows up that they've never seen before. You might argue, we know what they all are, but I would argue we have no clue as to what they might be in the future. But if one of these would show up and you could tell what it was, then in fact there might be instructions that go along with it, not in it, but accessible from it, that lets you know what it is. So these digital objects are not only these bit sequences, but they have a unique associated persistent identifier. Persistence is a funny word, because if I were to say to you, is one persistent, you wouldn't know really what that means unless we defined it. To me, persistence of an identifier means that you can resolve that identifier into something meaningful about the thing it's identifying. I call it state information. It might be something as simple as, here are n places on the internet that you can access that object. It might be a public key that's associated with it, because the identifier is really identifying information about an individual. It might be terms and conditions for use. Today you have no idea what you can do with anything you get off the internet. You may have a hunch, but you don't know for sure. Or maybe authentication information. You were looking for a law from years ago from some country on a given date. How do you know what you got is in fact the law the way it was? So you need authentication information. And then you have all the issues about authenticating the authentication. So somebody produces a birth certificate. How do you know the birth certificate is the real birth certificate? If you try to set up a corporation somewhere and they ask for proof that the corporation that's setting up the corporation is a legitimate one, how do you prove that? So there are all these issues that come into play. So that's lingua franca, I think, of the future that we're all going to be buying into sooner or later. But keep in mind that if we make this change, it's probably going to have to involve the players who are some of the key players today, because otherwise it'll be too threatening. So digital objects are probably not meaningful unless you can access them. The model we had was that they were in repositories, and repositories were accessible by identifiers. So if you knew the identifier of something, you could go to a repository and ask for it. And those repositories could be mobile programs in their own right, and so they could show up at your front doorstep like the old good humor men showed up with ice cream, if you recall, instead of having to go to some store somewhere else. But once we took out mobility from this architecture, the repository would be in a place. So maybe eventually we can free them up to become more mobile as well. And you're not going to remember all these identifiers, because we might have a huge number of things. I mean, we're thinking of numbers that might be 10 to the 50 to 60 to 70, really huge numbers of these objects going forward, and maybe, potentially unlimited. It could be marched toward infinity. So how do you remember them? Well, the answer is, another part of this architecture is registries. Registries keep metadata about the objects. Except that in this world of information, it's not like Google going around scraping public websites, because much of this information is going to be localized. And the parties that actually create the information are going to want to create the metadata that goes with it, or at least say what it could be, and have that accessible for searching. So those are sort of the attributes of it, and the thing that we put into this definition of an architecture was the ability of this information to persist over very long periods of time with security. So if you came back in 50 years or 100, maybe this is government information which wants to persist in perpetuity. I used to chair the NARA Advisory Committee on Electronic Records, and they would like that, some of that information to be around forever. It's persistent government information. Well, how many of you have ever heard of VisiCalc? Anybody in the audience know what that is? Okay, a few hands. So if somebody were to send you a VisiCalc spreadsheet today, would you know what to do with it? That's only like 30 some odd years ago. The answer is, well, you could probably say, let me go see if I can find a VisiCalc program, because it's got a proprietary data format. And then you'd find out, even if you could get it, maybe you could find out that it has to run on DOS 1.0, because that was the system for which it was developed. And that really took into account some of the unique features of the IBM PC implementation. So you have to find an environment in which to run DOS 1.0, if you could even get that. And there's no reason why one should expect that information, even if you got the actual bits, would be understandable in the future without some approach to dealing with that. So that's another set of issues that are, squarely on the table for us, but the architecture was intended to deal with. Now it turns out data typing is really important, and it's come up now in spades in this issue of big data and research data alliance that the US and the European Union, along with Australia, originally set up, is trying to deal with these issues. Somebody gave you a terabyte of data, 10 terabytes, 100 terabytes, and said, have at it. You would have no idea what to do. These are just a sea of bits, and unless they're substructured, that's where typing information comes in. So here's a piece, and this is what type of information it is. It's from a sensor. It's from a sensor of a certain kind that was manufactured. It got temperature information and the like. So you have an ability to understand what the data is, how it's structured, how it's formatted, and how it's coded. This is all pretty important stuff. So types now become important, but people are going to read them in different languages. So types themselves become a kind of digital object that have their own identifiers. And so you structure this thing with identifiers all over the place. It really is, the fundamentals that keep things going, like IP addresses are in the internet. When I used to talk about the internet back in the 70s, people would say, that's a very interesting talk, but tell me again why I would want an IP address. They wouldn't quite get it. And today when I talk about this architecture, people don't have all these objects. When the web came along, so they don't understand actually why they need all these identifiers. But in time they will. I mean, people now have trouble just understanding where certain information is in their own computers because they have so much of it. Well, maybe some of the searching techniques for that machine will help, but it's when it's distributed over the entire globe, or maybe beyond that, it becomes a very different kind of problem. So these are some of the kind of things that we are looking into that I think are going to be important for the future. There are standards bodies that look into it. The biggest issue that we faced in trying to get this idea out was very related to the internet governance problem that the world has been dealing with since the very first WSIS meeting in Geneva in 2003, and maybe before that for a while. And that was the question of ICANN essentially governing the internet, which it of course didn't, but that was the stated perception of the rest of the world. Whether they really believed it or not is a different issue. And the whole issue was for the US to decide to let go or not. Well, the US made a very strong decision originally not to let it go, and just recently, as you know, they made a decision to let it go. One can only speculate on why that change occurred, but the fact of the matter is that that transition just occurred as of September 30th. So far, it's like, to me, the Brexit issue. Is Brexit a good idea or a bad idea? The answer is, if you don't do anything, then all the old issues will continue to fester. if you do something, you don't know what the future is like, and some people would say, well, let's see. I mean, at least the old issues now go away. And with the internet transition, it could be very similar in some ways. You know, if you don't let it go, then all the concerns about the U.S. being, quote, in charge will continue to fester. And if you let it go, then who knows what the future will be like. My guess, this is probably going to work out. But in the case of the digital object infrastructure, which has been out on the internet now for 20 years in one way, shape, or form. In fact, it's widely used in the publishing industry, the entertainment industry, a lot of people who are dealing with this. Countries around the world who were uncomfortable with repeating this internet governance issue came to us and said, we'd like to use this infrastructure, but not if a U.S. organization is running it. And so after a lot of discussion, we finally ended up agreeing to set up a foundation in Geneva that would allow for distributed administration of the root system at the information node. This is not in any way, in my view, about the current internet and what it's done. So the issue of domain names and IP addresses and all of that stuff is part of what we will use. This is building on it in a logical extension kind of way. So it's not in any way a challenge or a threat to those things, but saying here's a way of thinking about things at a higher level. And we now have, and have had in place for a while, distributed administration of this root system, which is, I think, a very interesting addition to the notion of how to manage information on a global basis. So a lot of these technologies are being used in ways that we haven't yet really come to grips with in this country. But many of these approaches being taken externally are being done in a very different way. So there's a cultural issue at stake here. Namely, in some of the countries around the world, they're taking a kind of holistic, almost government-led approach to how to manage things to make sure there's stability in the marketplace. In the U.S., we tend to be hands-off until the market gets developed and try to regulate it if necessary. But the whole approach has been that the U.S. companies want to essentially develop the technologies and play a leadership role, which is what we've done right from the get-go. And I think this is not going to be the way it goes that simply. We're seeing developments in China, in India, even in the African countries where I just came back from. And so I think it requires a mindset to how to live in this world of the future where the U.S. is not the only player, the main leading player. And I think this is a big challenge for all of us. So I think I'm going to leave it at that and just simply say that there's a more complicated issue than just governing the current internet. We've got to think about the future, what it should look like, and really do a good job of trying to represent the best interests not only of the United States and our companies, but to make it work on a global basis as well. Thank you.
Just one editorial comment that I won't forget. Interesting that the internet, I was reminded of Gandhi's, what's reputed to be Gandhi's quote on, first they ignore you, then they laugh at you, then they try to destroy you, and then you win. And with the internet, they tried to kill it, and then they tried to buy it. Well, Milton Mueller's coming up. Thank you. Move this microphone away so it doesn't fall.
Can we have the slides up, please? There we go. So the theme I'm going to start with, and this is supposed to be an introductory comment, and then we'll have some discussion among the panelists, is something I call alignment. Now, how many of you have heard about this theme that the internet is fragmenting, that it's breaking apart? Is that something you've heard about? Well, that's the issue I'm addressing, because I think it's really the most profound issue facing the internet and the problem of internet governance today, and it's directly related to cybersecurity. Let's see if this slide changer works. Does it? It doesn't seem to be. Can you change the slide for me? All right. So that's the next slide, please. This is the theme of my most recent book. So I've got a list of things. If you could hit the Hit the key there. Yeah, because this is not working. Just keep going down. What do we mean by fragmentation of the internet? Everything on this list has been described as some form of fragmentation, and including language differences, which I think is pretty silly. I'm being ironic there, and also the digital divide, which is not really fragmentation at all. It's simply the lack of expansion of the internet into certain areas. But if we go to the next slide, I think what's behind the issue of fragmentation is something much more profound, and then hit it again. It's what I'm calling alignment. And alignment is the attempt by national governments to basically impose upon cyberspace their own jurisdictional overlay. Next slide. The world of states is fragmented. It is territorial. We have boundaries around each of these territories. And as Dr. Kahn noted, the whole point of the internetworking protocols, and I agree with him, it's simply a set of software protocols, was to make all of this information globally compatible. And so we've learned that making all this information globally compatible creates some social problems in addition to massive social benefits. And what we're doing is we're dealing with the mismatch between our structures of political authority and the global flows of information that occur with this global compatibility. Next slide, please. So alignment is, hit the key, the subjugation of the cyber domain to political jurisdictions. And if you want the perfect state of alignment, all you have to do is go back to the pre-internet era of what we call post-telephone and telegraph monopolies, in which you had a perfect alignment between the scope and territory of the telephone company and the state. And you had it state-owned and state-regulated. Even the manufacturers and sometimes the technical standards were based on the national element. Next slide, please. So the internet basically blasted away that old system of PTT state alignment, and now governments, all of them, not just China and Russia, all of them are in many ways trying to realign their structures of control with cyberspace. So hit key number 1. And one of the most important areas and rationales and methods of alignment is what I call national securitization. And that is the development of cyberspace as a military domain, which of course is something that is linked to national governments and their jurisdiction. The nationalization and centralization of threat intelligence, replacing this kind of informal transnational community of engineers sharing information with national certs, national CSerts, programs like the information sharing program recently implemented by DHS after the passage of CISA, and even sometimes moving towards national technical standards for certain kinds of equipment or certification of equipment and maybe even encryption. And the ultimate is the kill switch, right? Next slide. Of course, I'm not going to concentrate on these. If you hit the next key, there's 2 other mechanisms for alignment, which in this conference I want to concentrate on the security element, but there's also this territorialization of information flows, which you get through the filtering of content, which China has pioneered, but also the data localization and the geo-blocking initiatives that you see around the world. And there's also been some attempt to align critical internet resources, that is, to make names and addresses subject to territorial authority of states. It's harder for that to succeed because of the design of the internet protocols and the legacy impact of having these globalized resources. Next slide, please. Hit the next 3 keys. There you go, very good. So you can see pretty clearly how cybersecurity is really a part of this overall alignment process. We have cyber sabotage, we have data sovereignty issues, and we have export control issues attempting to impose these borders on cyberspace. Next slide. Yeah, there's a whole bunch of stuff where you could talk about specifics, but again, this is introductory. Now, that being said, there are constraints on alignment, and alignment doesn't really work if you want to have a true internet. If you really want to have developed the potential of the technology to really realize what it can do for humanity, you don't want alignment. Next slide. One of the things is what I call the jurisdictional paradox. And that is, if you really want to have complete control of information in your territory, you essentially have to cut yourself off from the internet. On the other hand, and that means that you are sacrificing most of the benefits of the internet. So if you want your control to be effective and have the benefits of the connectivity, you have to extraterritorialize your authority. And a good example of this is where France tried to impose this idea of the right to be forgotten on Google. Google says, okay, in your little country code, your little territorial part of cyberspace, we will implement that. And they said, no, that's not good enough. People can get around it too easily. So we want you to globally impose the right to be forgotten. And so you have a contradiction between the capabilities of cyberspace and this attempt at alignment. Let's go on to the next slide. I really want to wrap this up quickly. Keep pushing. These are all the things that you're sacrificing. Economic efficiency in the global scope of the internet. We can touch on that more later in the discussion. Next slide. The question is, if we don't have alignment, if we don't have the territorial sovereignty of states, what do we have? And in that book that I showed, I'm developing a very radical idea, which is the idea of popular sovereignty in cyberspace. Next slide. So you know, national sovereignty has a history. It hasn't always been like this, and we have nation states. Actually, many of them are very recent, within the last 50, 60 years. Some of them are older, but you know, even Germany and Italy did not exist as nation states until the 19th century. Next slide. So the significance of the IANA transition is that we have, in fact, created a global governance scheme that is no longer dominated by any sovereign, and it's not a treaty of a bunch of sovereigns. It is a truly non-state-based global governance regime. And so I call it the first battle for popular sovereignty in cyberspace. And with that, we'll go to the discussion. Thanks.
I apologize for the technical failure on the clicker device. You can't expect to use technology without having technological failure. I'm glad you also put up a slide with Ted Cruz. I think that's why you put the slides up this morning. We'll get the Texan in the room up in a dander about something.
It was the climax of the show.
Yes, it really is. So I have a number of questions. We're going to have time for a few questions here on the day, and then open it up to the room. And your concept of popular sovereignty is an interesting one. These ideas of battles, we're going to come to your global war topic. It's all a reminder, we've had a lot of hyperbolic conversation at the highest level about information revolutions and what they need. And does this structure that was constructed 40 years ago mean that the radical reordering of society, and does internet governance really translate to new forms of social and political organization? But I want to start with this concept that Laura put in her book, The Global War for Internet Governance, on the Yale University Press, on this idea of global war for governance. I mean, that's a strong term. Could you elaborate on that a bit?
Certainly. First, just a fun fact. Someone advised me that for the title, you should either use food, sex, or violence, and I thought the violence would be safest. Global war for internet governance. But I really do mean that in some sense, around fifth domain of warfare, around conflict, around values and tension that exist in cyberspace. I mean, that's one of the most interesting aspects of this, just tying together what all of us have said. We have a system that transcends national borders very profoundly and very clearly, where just one transaction over the internet can involve a company incorporated in one country, servers located in another country, the domain name registered in somewhere else, and call centers located somewhere else. And then sometimes, even if a transaction takes place in one country, it might trombone to another country to an internet exchange point, right? It just doesn't map neatly onto these boundaries.
Mm-hmm.
But that being said, there really is a tension right now between the traditional, internet infrastructure world, in which Bob Kahn and Vincent Cerf developed the protocols, and this new kind of discourse around the control of cyberspace, which is quite different, and that's cyber sovereignty, where we have very, very strong messages from China, we have very, very strong messages from Russia, and also other countries that are looking to control the internet. So I think Milton's book couldn't come at a better time to look at this issue of fragmentation.
Dr. Kahn, I have a question for you about, it comes from hosting Len Kleinrock a while back. We're in a military conference here. ARPA, DARPA produced the funding for the internet. And I guess this idea of a new domain of warfare, it still makes kind of the John Perry Barlow technologists like me who are idealistic on the internet, and I grew up in the 1990s internet space as an engineer. Where is the civil, military, political divide? Who are the stakeholders? And I guess, really, at what point did you feel that political interests that were powerful realized this thing that your cohort created was of great interest to them and something they wanted to control?
Well, it's actually, about 5 or 10 questions.
It is. I'm having a hard time finding them all together.
So let me see how to tease this apart. First of all, when we started, we had the budget. So it wasn't a matter of trying to convince somebody to create this global capability. We were just trying to understand technically how would you get different, originally computers on one network and then multiple networks and multiple computers to all interoperate together. Keep in mind that when the internet really began as a kind of project, it was a research project. We only had these large mainframe machines. Most of them were batch machines, which didn't really work interactively, but only a small number of interactive time-sharing machines. We had to figure out how to put them on nets, and there was a lot of controversy about that. I gave a lecture at the National Academy a number of years ago on one of these, I forget what it was, Intel or Westinghouse Talent Search, where they had like 1,000 of the brightest young kids, mainly between about, I would say, 14 and 17. This young lady who was 15 years old, very articulate spokesperson for the whole group, got up and thanked me for my talk and said, the question we want to know more than any other one is how did you manage to convince all the governments of the world to let you build the internet? Not an unreasonable question for a 15-year-old who's used to living in a world of authority. I said, you're not going to like the answer, because when we started out, I know it may be hard to understand it today, but aside from the handful of us that were working on trying to figure out how to make the technology work, nobody thought this was a good idea. And therefore, nobody paid any attention. We had free running room. I mean, I can cite you example after example where people kind of weighed in. You were asking questions about political authority. I guess there's the military, civilian side of it as well. But everything that ICANN was doing, I did in a microcosm for the first 3 or 4 years, and then handed that off and contracted with USC. So John Postel then ran it for about 20 years until he eventually got ill, the politics got complicated, ICANN got set up, and the U.S. government decided to weigh in more strongly. But John called me one day and he said he had gotten a call from the office of the King of Jordan. And John had been hand-picking people to sort of expand the DNS system. So the .Jordan, .jn, I guess, country code was being run by a professor at the University of Jordan, and the office of the king called and said, how did this guy get to do that for the whole country? And John apparently told him that you have to get back to him, he's tied up right now. He calls me on the phone, he says, what should I tell him? I said, tell him this is a matter for Jordan to figure out and let us know. They went back to the drawing board, they found out there was only one person in all of Jordan that knew anything about this, which was this guy. So they asked him if he would continue running it. He said, fine. They called John and said, we'd like this guy to continue doing it. And the issue went away. So politics of it, little by little, kind of just sort of developed. But you have to keep in mind, this was all about a research project going on. None of us were setting out to do something, at this level. I used to have a lot of fun with people. In the early days, I gave very serious answers. It's like, could you see everything that would happen? But after a while, I would say, of course we could see everything that would happen. We knew that in 10 years we'd invent the PC, and we knew in about 15 there would be multiple carriers, and we knew in about 20 years the voucher bill would open everything up. And look at me and say, really? So, the other thing that I did want to comment on is that most of what people have been thinking about in terms of what can happen is all about the technology. And keep in mind that it doesn't have to be that way. Every country has the right to unplug themselves. Maybe they can't shield all the electromagnetic radiation, but when you begin to think about countries acting differently than they typically have in the past, it becomes unrealistic. So the fact that the concerns that has suggested may come about or are coming about, to me, just simply recognize the reality of what we live in. The interesting thing about the digital object approach, that whole architecture, which is in the public interest, is that it talks about the information itself. So you interact with the information, not with a piece of the technology. That's what allows you to do this persistently, because if you're talking about the old ARPANET, we were identifying machines on that network. What's on wire 1? That was this machine. What's on wire 2? It's that machine. When we were now in the internet environment, identifying a wire on the ARPANET didn't help. So that's why we invented IP addresses, so you can actually identify the machine. Web comes along, now they're identifying files on the machine, either with an IP address or a DNS name. But in the evolution of time, that's not going to work. The early days of the web, I don't know the exact numbers, but the half-life of a URL was maybe a year or two. Mm-hmm. I don't know that there was any systematic measurement. In 5 years, 95% of them didn't work. So if you're looking for a system of persistence, that clearly can't be the solution. But when you're dealing with the information itself, and you can have the information itself encrypted and managed, so
could you address the connection between your persistent identifiers and the right to be forgotten? What happens when the governments decide they want the right to be forgotten, and your identifier is persistent? Do they block it? Do you have to censor your links?
People who create the information can control what happens to that information, at least in the official. If people then take information and they put it somewhere, you might not even know about it. So the notion of a right to be forgotten, to me, is a poorly formed right.
Sure, but it's still a political issue.
Yeah, I'm not saying it isn't a political issue, but you can be against many things for which there's no obvious way to deal with it. For what I am saying is that every organization in the world is going to have to come to grips with which of its pieces of information, all objects, do they wish to be made publicly available. They went through that when the web came along. And it wasn't a matter of saying, well, is it an advertisement or not? Now it was, what do we put on our public-facing webpage? That was a new
decision making that they had to do. I think there's a bigger issue now because every organization, every individual may have to start thinking about which of their objects do they wish to have public facing, which do they wish to have private, and that's not an unusual thing. And
No, it's very normal for this audience to...
Every government is going to want to be able to say that about its information and have different rules about what the citizens of its country can do. So it's no longer about unplugging or plugging necessarily, it's about managing access to the information itself.
Right.
The question that Milton is raising is not an easy question to have an answer to, any more than security is an easy question to have an answer to. I mean, people ask over and over and over again about, well, why don't we have enough security? They often will assert that nobody in the early days even thought about it. Nothing could be further from the truth. They think wireless showed up later. But the fact of the matter is that there was a tension on day one between the needs of law enforcement, national security, and the needs of the private sector for privacy. That issue is still here today. That issue will be there in the future, and there's no cookie-cutter answer. And even if you had an answer in one country, it's not clear that's the right answer in another country. So these are all issues that have to be taken into consideration and try and answer a question like that.
Okay, thank you. One question for you, Milton. And I want to get this out there. Just the politics. Your last slide was the one that I was most curious about having. You know, I've met Ted Cruz. He's my senator. I'm coming to grips with that. We're not supposed to talk about politics here, but I've disagreed with him on some things. Do you think that his thinking represents a certain sovereign paranoia, or is there validity in his thinking? And what would you say to him if you had 2 to 3 minutes to sit down with Senator Cruz right now, and you know what he said and thought? What would you say back?
Well, I would love to have a direct conversation with Ted Cruz. I had an indirect one with him during the controversy over the ANA transition because newspapers kept calling me up and saying, is what he's saying true? And out of that came a PolitiFact wrong rating and 3 Pinocchios from the Washington Post. But I think what he does represent is, in fact, a crystallization and a very clear posing of the issue that I'm talking about with alignment. That is, if you live in a world mentally of nation states, sovereign nation states, why would a government ever give up something that they control? You know, if you think that the public interest is synonymous with the state rather than with a global public, why are we doing this? And the answer, I think, is clear that the global connection of people through the internet protocols and through other means has created an interest in this public in having a compatibility and a governance structure that is independent of states and their military and security interests. We have a need for security, cybersecurity, but that is not the same thing as national security anymore. It is not the same thing. And if you equate the two, then you're not going to be optimizing internet governance, you're going to be optimizing military governance and setting in motion rivalries among states which will work to the disadvantage of the efficiency, fairness, and capabilities of the information economy.
And I want to have one general question, and then we should really open it up to the room, because they've been quiet and patient. One of the issues that I've had a difficult time with over the last few years is the establishment, and Milton, your comments are definitely would be at odds with many people in the Pentagon, I think. But this idea of making cyberspace a military domain, and each of you, if you can start with Lauren, is going, just tell me what you think about that, what you think works about it or doesn't work about it, and really what internet governance thinking might, because this is kind of off the beaten path for a cyber or security discussion. Internet governance is kind of viewed as, oh, that's some soft diplomatic thing, when I couldn't disagree more. So Tell me what you think about this cyber domain thing, about where the United States is on this vis-a-vis other countries in the world, and how you feel about it.
Well, I view internet governance as a global issue, right? You can't just ask that question in the context of the U.S. government and military, because we have to deal with all the other governments and how they're treating cyberspace as well. But I would say that just a couple of points. One is that the vast majority of the internet infrastructure is owned and operated by the private sector, and that's a very important point. So. Are you suggesting that the military come in and seize assets or control private sector? It's a dilemma, because we talk about cyber like it's an actual thing, right? But it's made up of many, many different networks. Most of them are operated by the private sector, and I'm not just talking about network operators and information intermediaries. I'm talking about financial services companies that have their own networks and are responsible for their own security. I'm talking about Internet of Things kinds of operators, and we've seen some of the challenges that arise with that. So I would say that there are a lot of different layers to this. There's the paradigmatic responsibility of governments to enact national security and take whatever measures are necessary in cyberspace, so to speak, in order to provide that security. And then there's also providing the private sector with the incentives and the requirements to secure cyberspace. So I think it's important to remember that a lot has to happen in the private sector in order to have the kind of cybersecurity that is necessary.
When I was in DARPA running the IT office, we would always rely on the fact that anything that the public sector could make use of, the military could make use of as well. It didn't matter whether it was food, the military needed it. Healthcare, the military needed it. New technology, the military could use it. I mean, there was no set of things that this is only useful in the private sector and this is only useful in the military. So we're talking about a common domain of capabilities out there, and I mean, ultimately, when you get down to it, whether the military can work in that domain or not means, do they have access to what they need to carry out their mission? That's about the only way you can really place this question. You can't say, is the military taking over cyber, unless you're talking about a political comment about the way our society works as a whole. And this is not a comment about cyber, because it would be taking over everything. And I don't think that's what you were asking about.
No.
So, as a practical matter, it's not a realistic question. I mean, you can debate it and discuss it, but when you come down to it, there are more basic questions that have to be answered, and I think they have to do with things like freedom of information and who can control it, and do people have the right to speak out? And the answers are going to be different everywhere you go.
Yeah, I think cyber is a domain. It is correct for the military to identify it as a separate domain for their operations. The question is, some of them recognize that this is a global domain that changes the nature of territory. Some of them don't. They speak about it in old-fashioned terms. They say, we have to defend our cyberspace, or we consider it a national asset. I mean, what kind of a statement is that? We think of cyberspace as a national asset. How does that go over for the 192 other nation states? What does that mean to them? So, to my mind, the model, I think it's only a model, but there are certain parallels, is the law of the seas, where you have a recognized zone, and the object of the military is to defend the openness and freedom of that zone, not to control it in the sense that you control territory. So we have the high seas being essentially free of sovereignty, and the job of our military is to keep those lanes open, recognizing how much the global economy and our well-being of our own country, as well as every other country, depends on that freedom to trade and to communicate.
All right, now it's your turn. So, hand back there.
I'll start off just taking prerogative. So I have the benefit of studying with Chris and then for extension under Dr. Mueller as well. So I've had a lot of benefit in this regard, taking like the third generation, if you will. But one of the questions I'd like to ask is we talk a lot about this movement of states in through new institutional structures, multi-governance type, multilateral institutionalism and other types of things, but in particular the movement of the ITU and other types of organizations in, and I'm bringing in a bunch of cadets and a bunch of others in the next couple of weeks. I'm talking about this idea of dangerous democracy. What does it mean to give states the prerogative to affect authority on institutions that historically have no basis in state power, such as institutions that define protocols and other types of things that are largely non-state based, and where a large number of states are now trying to assert authority in those types of functions?
Well, let me jump in. First of all, the internet today, if we think of it as the protocols and procedures for making things work together, is the result of many, many different attributes. People often think that there are particular standards bodies that were there up front. You have to remember that the TCP/IP protocols were very ad hoc for at least the first decade, if not a little longer, because the IETF didn't come along until the mid-1980s. We ran the secretariat for it for a long time. But before that, we're just trying to create a community. Virtually everybody that I knew of in the 70s was committed to, except for us, committed to using international protocols once they'd been formulated. Today, if you look at the internet writ large, there are lots of things that are built on top of it. There are standards being used. Well, for example, the Ethernet is probably the most widely used network of all the elements in the internet, and that's an IEEE standard. You have WIP consortium standards, but that's at the application level. You have 3GPP, you have ITU, you have ETSI. You have all of these different groups, and they all contribute. I was at a meeting once where Bob Metcalf used to call this FOCACA, which he defined as meaning freedom of choice among competing elements or competing alternatives. The fact of the matter is, the industry is the one that has to decide what to do in building their products and services. There's no one party that can describe standards for the world, and there shouldn't be probably. And so industry is going to look for the best choices, and they're all interested in interoperability at some level. They're all interested in good competing products at some level. So to me, it doesn't matter necessarily where they come from. Although many people have objected to the ITU being involved at all, many of their protocols are in fact used in today's internet. That happens to be an organization where industry and academia can participate, but it's actually controlled by governments. The IETF and all of the IANA functions were presumably controlled, probably not IETF, but the IANA functions controlled by government through those contracts. But I doubt that the government could have actually taken an action that could have had a global effect on the internet. I was at many meetings where countries would get up and say, there's this switch in the basement of the Pentagon. If you just flip it, it will cut off my country. And not only was there no such switch, many of the things that people thought took place by virtue of the government contract with ICANN actually never really took place at all. So I don't see this as an issue, and I think as long as industry has the ability to produce its products and services, there will be government oversights and regulatory issues. We heard from the Federal Trade Commission this morning. If you've got dangerous products in the marketplace, if you've got anti-competitive, you've got misleading products, all of that stuff needs to be overseen and will be overseen basically wherever it can be, in whatever manner it can be. And that's okay. That's the way it should be. But to go beyond that, I think, is really not practical. Or do you have some points you wanted to make?
Yeah, I'll just add that I personally think that multilateral approaches to most areas of internet governance are not a good idea. In general, and this is not a normative statement, but just a descriptive one, that governments really, if you think about this in the global sense, just don't have a good track record when it comes to the internet. If you think of the systems of censorship that are imposed in different areas, if you think about interest in getting involved in standard setting and doing things that are that provide barriers to competition, if you look at systems of surveillance around the world. So oftentimes an institution like the United Nations will be a draw for countries that have very repressive information approaches. And that's why the multi-stakeholder is a very difficult term to describe, but it involves more of a balance of powers that brings in civil society and the private sector. One final point on that is the reason that the internet has been so successful is because, in part, because of this idea of permissionless innovation, where companies can take the ball and run with it with standards and have the freedom to do that without having to ask permission. So when you start introducing multilateral processes, you have to ask the question, what will that do to the ability to quickly innovate and to have permissionless innovation?
Next question from the floor.
Hi, Sarah McHugh from Citizenland. I thought Milton made an excellent point about the jurisdictional paradox and the extraterritorialization of authority, because I think we're seeing that more and more, not only through legal approaches such as the right to be forgotten, but also through actual digital attacks, such as that launched by North Korea against Sony Pictures, which was based on sort of the ideological confrontations represented by a Hollywood movie, as well as the Great Cannon attack, which was linked to China and involved a DDoS attack against GitHub and GreatFire.org. And I'm wondering, to what extent, what do you think this portends for international law itself? Because I think we're seeing that the jurisdictional paradox is sort of engendering conflict. And while we're making progress on international law's application to cyber through the Talon Manual and other efforts, it seems like there's this much more insidious problem of the extraterritorialization of ideological precepts and control that we have yet to deal with.
Well, excellent question. I do fundamentally believe that that problem is fundamental and inevitable in the world of states, because they are living in a state of anarchy, in effect. They are all sort of local monopolies on the legitimate use of force, and sometimes not so legitimate uses of force. And so as long as we have states, with control of violence within their territory, and they have this global mechanism which sort of levels the playing field for global scope, we're going to have these kinds of problems. Just to give you an example, in the current world, when you're talking about kinetic power, the U.S. is really the only nation capable of having a global presence. But then in cyberspace, you've lowered the bar so that almost anybody, even Iran or North Korea, can have some kind of a global impact. So I think what we have to do is we're going to have to develop new institutional mechanisms, which is what Aaron was referring to, and those are going to have the same level of legitimacy and backing from civil society and business, in addition to governments, that sort of denationalizes many of these processes associated with global internet governance. And that brings me back to a point that Chris was alluding to, which is the connection between cybersecurity and internet governance. To me, I know many people view internet governance as kind of a little sideline of cybersecurity, but to me, cybersecurity is just the latest internet governance problem, and probably one of the biggest and most important in terms of its long-term implications. But it is an internet governance problem. It's like, how do we handle some of the problems caused by connecting people up in the internet? And what many people, particularly in this space of cybersecurity, have tried to differentiate cyberspace from the internet. And it's true that there's more to the electronic world than the internet protocols, but the more you look at it, the more you realize that what brings it all together and makes it this interconnected space, which poses all these new security problems, is in fact the internet protocols and their global compatibility. So to me, I'm not really answering your question in terms of having a recipe for how to handle that problem. What I'm saying is it's fundamental to internet governance, and we will have to evolve solutions, and I'm merely trying to point out, don't think that you're going to solve those solutions by reverting back to a sovereigntist, state-directed approach to things.
Thank you. We have time for one more question? Okay, we've got about 5 minutes.
I'm curious as to whether you think the a technology that's become as pervasive as the internet, that's spread globally, can lead to the creation of pan-European governance models that are socioeconomic, even beyond what the EU is trying to do today.
Let me take a stab at that one. The one thing that's interesting about the Europeans and internet and technology issues is that I've always felt there was a bias in Europe to approach internet and tech issues, or not a bias, but an opportunity, because of the EU growing and arising at the same time as the internet did. But I guess, pan-European value, I think our idea of pan-Europeanness at this point is also fragmenting pretty rapidly. I think the value space that I hear from the most is when I talk to my colleagues in places like Brazil or South Africa, or other major, or Nigeria, which is one of the most populous countries on the planet already, where they say, how do we compete with the West on our value set versus yours in cyberspace? Which, on the face of it, I look at it and think, what competition? What do you mean? I mean, it's all ones and zeros. But this idea that we kind of have this westernized OECD kind of audience of countries that have really built out most of the internet, but now we have these other countries that, of course, have a big impact and role to play. I guess on the Europeans, they certainly like to use regulation a bit more, perhaps, than others do, although I'm not an expert on that. But when we look to initial state-based and multi-state policies, the Europeans are certainly guideposts for us, and were. Any comments on the question?
Well, one point I would make is that I see a globalization of governance for communications and information, but not necessarily for everything. I don't think police forces and schools are going to be globalized in their governance. I think that there will be all kinds of roles that will still be performed best by territorial states. But it's just that the technology of communication and information, I think, has passed the point at which territorially based governance works, and that we need to therefore talk about the articulation of territorial states with global governance of communication and information. To give you an example, when law enforcement now, just routine kinds of law enforcement, will want access to information about criminal activity, but because somebody in Germany is using Facebook to get that person's information, they have to go apply through a mutual legal assistance treaty to get the information. And that's a very clumsy and awful process at the moment. So that's the kind of place where if you're going to have global governance, you need to articulate the relationship between these local authorities and the global capabilities, and all kinds of interesting issues are posed by that, such as, for example, what if this local authority is a dictatorship and they want to harass a dissident rather than, a legitimate concern about criminal behavior.
So I would simply point out that to me, infrastructure is really a means of lowering the barriers to certain developments that are built on with the help of that infrastructure, and it's a subtractive process. So an artist, painting on an easel, it's an additive process. They put more and more brushstrokes on the easel, and eventually a picture shows up. But to a sculpture, they're taking stuff away. They start with a piece of clay or marble, and they're sculpting it down. Infrastructure is really, the task of somebody designing infrastructure and really a world-class level is something that can be scalable and last over the test of time. And that means it's got to have only essentials in it. The Internet's a very interesting phenomenon in that for some odd decades that it's been around, everything that it's interconnecting has scaled up by about a factor of a million times in bandwidth, a million times in processing power, the amount of memory you can buy for the same amount of money, and assuming it's around for another decade, which I assume it will be around the globe, a factor of a billion or a trillion. There's nothing like that you can point out in technology. It just doesn't tend to happen. And it won't happen if the infrastructure is complicated. So when you bring together parties around the world to try and figure out how to deal with some of these false epithets, and I say that not to say that it's a wrong concept in its own sense, but it's really a name of a discussion topic. So when you talk about information wants to be free, well, information doesn't want anything. It's a bunch of bits, I presume. And, what does it mean to want to be free? And whose freedom and whose information? Or when you talk about other kinds of similar things, you have to figure out, that's a conversation topic. And, you can break it down into specifics, but if you brought all the nations of the world together to talk about any such topic, whether you call it false or not, whether you think it's real, the right to be forgotten, well, that's not the way I think about rights, because rights are normally things that you get from an authority that you can back up in a court of law in some way, shape, or form. And I don't know where this right comes from, unless it's, religious right of some sort. So you bring these people together, and you're trying to form kind of an infrastructural consensus, which means you fundamentally got to get to the lowest common denominator of what's essential to everybody. And once you do, either that's essential to keep a capability in place around the world, or it's not. And generally speaking, I think every one of these countries is interested in some form of interoperability at some level with some amount of control. That's what that's about.
We're running out of time. Did you have a comment? Oh, okay. I know that Dr. Brantley and Kevin McDonald would like to come up and present some thanks. So if you would thank the panel with me.